Alright, what's up, Dragon Brood? Now, everybody does their end of year video, and I figure I might as well do a wrap up of 2023. And today we're going to do an award show for the best card out of each set. And we're just going to call it the Deuter Awards, because why not? We'll make it a tradition and we'll start doing this every year. Will the categories be the same next year? I have no idea. This is the first time we've done this. However, let me go ahead and give some credit to some companies that helped us get through the last year. Cool Stuff Inc., wonderful sponsor, helps us give you a discount by just using code DRAGON, save 5% over on their website. And we also have Pane Glasses, who always keep me looking fresh with my lenses. You can use my code there. I can put that in the links as well, so y'all can go save 5% if you gotta get caught up on your eyewear. And of course, Moxfield, because that's where we post all of our deck lists on our gameplay stuff. So check all those folks out. Links in the description. Anytime you support my sponsors, you get to keep supporting the channel. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna go down every set, and we're gonna do new cards. We're not gonna do like Dominator Remastered or Commander Masters, because those are mostly reprint sets. But we want to talk about sets that have lots of new cards, and just see what the best ones were from each set. So let's start at the top. We've got Phyrexia, All Will Be One. Now, there was a lot in this set. I think we had a lot of expectations, and it was filling a big storyline points of the Phyrexians coming back, and we were going to see all the Praetors again, and there was just lots of good stuff here. But the first card I want to bring up is Glissa, Sunslayer. This card's become a staple in pretty much every Golgari list, right? Even some Jund lists, right? If you're playing black and green, this is one of the best 3-mana cards you can have. It does so much, and it's hard to deal with because it has First Strike and Death Touch. You can't really avoid this card if you're playing the proper colors and playing creatures. We also have Ossification. Ossification has become kind of one of the top removal cards in Standard. It's actually great in the enchantments list. It's played in mono white aggro list. It's played in mono white control list. It's just become the removal of choice, being able to get rid of creatures and planeswalkers. And finally, Jace, the Perfected Mind. Now, Jace almost didn't make the list here as the third choice, but the thing here is this has been one of the staples of the Azorius control decks. It's played in mill decks, and it's the planeswalker that seemed to have found the most consistent home outside of Liliana. So yeah, this one deserves a nod, and I'm not even that big of a fan of the blue cards these days, but hey, I gotta give credit where it's due. Alright, and the winner is Glissa Sunslayer. Not too much of a surprise here, honestly. I mean, I think when you look across the board of these cards, which is being played the most, which is shown up in the largest variety of decks, and it makes sense that that's got to be our choice here. So, congratulations, Glissa. I guess in the future, maybe I'll do a thing with some cosplayer playing Glissa and doing a speech. But anyway, let's move on to the next set. The follow-up to that set is March of the Machines. And March of the Machines actually, I think, surprised a lot of us. I think there were more playable cards here than a lot of us really thought about or thought there would be. And that's not a bad thing. Having more cards that fit more quirky decks is always a good thing, but there were a lot of actual really good playable cards. So starting at the top, we have Sunfall. One of the cards that I probably gripe the most about on this channel, but having a removal card that exiles everything and then on top of it gives the person who played it an additional creature just seems ridiculous. And yeah, this card's still going to be around in Standard, I think, for another year plus, so we're just going to have to deal with this. But this is definitely one of the best cards come out of the set, hands down. But we also have Atali, Primal Conqueror. This card was also very good, and this shows up in a lot of lists, right? Reanimator decks. Later, because of Ixalan, we got to play it in dinosaur decks, right? It's in the Rakdos control type builds, right? It just shows up everywhere because it's so much value. You're playing one card to get 3 cards. That's rarely ever going to be a problem. And coincidentally, if you just need it, you can turn it into a big indestructible poisoning whatever and try to kill your opponent in one shot. And then to follow that up, we also have Breach the Multiverse. Now, while I don't think Breach the Multiverse is as popular, it's still just as strong. It lets you get your choice of things out of each graveyard, and it fits in a lot of the same decks that Atali does. But I think when it came down to choosing the overall card in the set, easily, the win had to go to Atali. I mean, let's be fair here. Atali actually is just an all-around difficult card to deal with. And once it triggers, I mean, you've now got to deal with bonus cards from it. Now, don't be wrong, I think it was a close second for Breach the Multiverse, but Atali, I think, is a card that's just shown up way more in more decks just because it was a dinosaur. Okay, now, let me say this next one I debated, and it's March of the Machines Aftermath, because it was like barely a set. I think it had like 50 cards or something, maybe not even a full 50. And it didn't make a huge impact, but there were cards there that mattered. So we're gonna still give an award for that set, and I don't think we're gonna see a set like this again in the future. This is probably a one and done type situation. But to start with, we have Calyx, Guided by Fate. This card is actually pretty interesting, but mostly in one deck, and that's the Celestial Enchantments list. However, that deck is quite popular, so you do get to see your fair share of Calyx on the ladder. Samet, Vizier of Noctamun, I believe that's how we say that. This one has actually surprised me. I've played it in several decks here on the channel. It's been a favorite of many of the viewers. Just having the whole thing with First Strike and being able to draw extra cards and haste, and like this card's just really all around useful, surprisingly, because it's like the first Samet that I felt like really gets to see some play. And then PNLR, Console of Revival. This card really was interesting because when it first came out, it was kind of like okay. But then as we got stuff with like Descend, and then we got these other cards that let you exile things to look at extra cards, all of a sudden, Pia started to become a real problem. And those Thopters having haste is also kind of a bonus. And then it combos well with a bunch of other cards. So this one was probably the toughest of the sets so far. But the winner is Pia Nalar. And that's not a huge surprise here. I think Pia has shown up in the largest variety of sets among these cards, or variety of decks, I should say, among these cards. And the other two, while good, didn't really like bring anything super new or creative, I guess, in the way of deck building. But it was cool to see that at least some cards out of Aftermath actually ended up mattering. All right, next up was Lord of the Rings. And this was interesting because this was the first Universes Beyond set for Magic the Gathering that had a full set launch. So we got everything, all the products, a full set, 300 and some cards. And this was neat of how it told the story of the set and really checked off all the boxes on the fandom. And it looked like Wizards was really going all in, letting the fans of these products be the ones to make the cards on the R&D team. And that's actually very welcome. However, I'm not going to yank your chain on this one. There was really only two cards to consider for this award out of this set. While I do think a lot of the set is very good, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of very playable things here, and I have them in several decks. This really was about the One Ring, mostly because of the PR aspect it brought to Magic the Gathering, right? We had this talked about on every website. We had the big purchasing of it from Post Malone. We had, the whole Willy Wonka aspect of trying to find the golden ticket. This was just fun and different. And side note, I expect Wizards is going to do something crazy since we have Marvel coming soon. Like, we might get an Infinity Gauntlet and then whatever, 6 stones that are all like one of ones. Like, think about how crazy that can be. But anyway, back to the awards. This is actually one of those things where the card almost overshadowed the set if it weren't for Orcish Bowmasters. Now, this card was kind of surprising because it wasn't a popular character. It was kind of just like too good for being the rare that it is. And it started showing up pretty much in every format where it's legal, like half the decks are playing it. And that means no real surprise here, but the duder goes to Orcish Bowmasters. It kind of has to, right? We can't justify giving it to anything else here. Like a card that literally is just, I won't say overly dominant, but makes an appearance in every format. And when it's played in sets of 4. So the card's just that good. All right, so our next setup, we have Wilds of Eldraine. This one's actually pretty interesting because this was another set that I think we thought could be good, but we weren't really sure. And the set ended up having so many playable cards in a whole variety of decks. And I think that was really nice and interesting. And even the new weird mechanic of being able to put enchantments on that were tokens, like that was kind of interesting. So this one actually, I think, exceeded expectations, which was nice considering it was coming later in the year and was following up Lord of the Rings and Commander Masters and some other goodies. But our cards here for the nominees are Virtue of Loyalty. This card has shown up in so many decks. And interestingly, it's not even just the hyper aggro decks or even the mid-rangey decks. Some of the control decks are finding ways to play this alongside like Wedding Announcement and make a few tokens, and all of a sudden you can have big tokens to finish the game with. And this has just been a great combat trick. It just fits so much stuff. But to go along with this, Virtue of Persistence. This was interesting because not only did we get a removal card, but we got one that lets us gain 2 life, while also giving us a card that lets us reanimate a creature from either player's graveyard. That's kind of crazy. The only thing that keeps this card from being completely out of whack is that so much of the good removal right now exiles, so that's a thing. And finally, Up the Beanstalk. A very inexpensive card to cast. Coincidentally, all three of these being enchantments, but hey, it's Wilds of Eldraine. It's all about enchantments, right? But this also lets you get extra cards for just doing what your deck already does. And several control decks are playing 5+ spells. There's a lot of stuff that are X spells that can let you draw, and then also things that get reduced costs. So this works in a lot of different ways, but I've even seen some just big green creature decks playing this so they can just draw cards from casting their giant monsters. And this card also ended up getting banned in a format. So there's that. But the duder for best card in Wilds of Eldraine goes to. No, not a surprise. Up the Beanstalk. I mean, if you're good enough to get banned and you can show up in control and in regular creature decks, like something's got to be said for that. Now, I will say, Wilds of Eldraine Eldraine this time wasn't as busted, but did have a lot of good cards to pick from here. So yeah, Up the Beanstalk, good job. And honestly, kudos to all of Wizards because this set was actually really sweet. All right, now next up we have the Doctor Who set. And this was a little bit tough because while it wasn't a full set because it was just in Commander decks, it did have lots of new cards. But then it also had a lot of reprints because it was trying to fill in all those Commander decks. But I decided it was worth covering again anyway, and we'll probably do this again next year for the sets that come out because there's enough new cards to talk about. But the first one here we're going to talk about is Everybody Lives. This is kind of like the new Teferi's Protection, sort of, right? It just says, hey, things don't die, everything's protected, and we get another turn. And people love those types of cards. And with this only being in Commander decks, and I don't know how long this set's actually going to be in print, this could end up being one of the more expensive cards in the set, unless we find somewhere to put this over the next 12 to 18 months. That being said, it at least has a very basic name that it could be reprinted. Sonic Screwdriver. This is a fun one because you wanted something that was evocative of Doctor Who, right? And we all know the Sonic Screwdriver does everything. He can make like hologram maps and work on things. He can open any lock, right? Then that's kind of what this card's trying to replicate, right? It can let you untap things, you can draw, you just activate things. There's so many cool things you can do with this card. And it was nice to see something like that, even so simple, be as versatile as the actual item in the show. And finally, the Master Multiplied. Now, this is just a weird card, but players seem to like things that turn off the legendary rule. And since this has Myriad, it can make copies of itself to come into play. And then, of course, if you have anything that triggers whenever these are doing their thing, that's a bonus that you don't get penalized for. And just turns out to be a pretty sweet card. Now, I haven't really found a way to break this, but some other people have. And that could lead to this having some long term value. But I think overall, this was a very fun set, very evocative of the property, and everybody walked away happy from this one. So, again, kind of like with Lord of the Rings, thanks for a good job there, Wizards. But the duder for best card in the Doctor Who set goes to Everybody Lives. That one was kind of obvious, it felt like. I mean, it was the most talked about card in the set. Even when it got previewed, everybody was immediately talking about it everywhere. And again, I expect this card to be very popular over the next few years and probably see an increase in value. And you're probably going to see this card popping up at your local commander tables. And our last set release of the year, at least full set, was Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And this was the one that I think we all knew was going to sell well, right? We hadn't had merfolk be relevant in a long time. People loved dinosaurs and vampires, and those were in the set. So we kind of knew, and pirates hadn't been really relevant for a while either. And they did this whole theme of doubling down on the whole like Mesoamerican, like just so much stuff going on there. And it was so beautiful. The art was great. The way all the cards worked were cool, the mechanics with the maps and things were really fantastic. This set really exceeded expectations even when we had them set very high. So, with that being said, the nominees for the best card in Lost Caverns of Ixalan are Roaming Throne, where this card turned out to be a surprise. I think we all thought it was going to be playable, but now this is becoming one of the most popular cards to play in themed commander decks, which is actually super sweet, and is actually turning out to make small splashes in standard, which is good because it's a colorless creature that can go into all kinds of stuff. We also have Get Lost. This is the new kind of removal of choice, and it can be played in multiple formats. And I expect since we have a 3-year standard, this card's probably going to see its value increase over the next 2 years because it's, well, except for artifacts, you can kind of kill most relevant things. And you can even use it on your own stuff if you want to try to get some maps to use for extra counters or artifacts entering the battlefield or whatever. It's a pretty versatile removal card, and I expect to see it to continue to keep seeing play. And finally, we have Trumpeting Carnosaur. This card, again, because it's a dinosaur, shows up in a lot of those decks, but it can show up in mid-rangey Rakdos stuff or even mid-rangey Gruul stuff, and even Jund stuff, right? We've seen it there. But getting the free cards from the Descend is such a big deal because 5 is a huge number, and sometimes you get stuff like Dracosaurs, which is great. But also, it tramples and it doubles as removal. And pretty much anytime you can get a card that lets you do something your deck needs early while also doing something late, it's hard to ignore that level of versatility. But the winner for best card in Lost Caverns of Ixalan goes to Roaming Throne. And that one I didn't think was going to come down the way I expected. I think as I started looking at more decks, I started looking over things we were having fun with over the last few weeks, and that one eked ahead. I think originally I was going to say Carnosaur, but as it turns out, I think I'm leaning on Roaming Throne. But I think all three of these cards are spectacular and definitely worth putting into your list. And finally, all of these things being said, I think it was just worthwhile the more I thought about it to just name a best overall set of the year. And each of these sets had a lot going for it. This was a pretty spectacular year, despite all the things outside of the game that have happened around Magic over the last 12 months. Man, we got so many good cards in 2023. Even beyond the ones we listed for each set. Like, I could have probably picked a good 6, 7 cards from each of these sets, and I don't think anybody would have been that upset. Like, it was a good year for Magic, and the reprint sets were spectacular too. But I think the best set of the year, surprisingly, goes to Lost Caverns of Ixalan. And my logic here is this. Like I mentioned before, we had high expectations, and it really exceeded that. But I think everything around it, with kind of everybody accepting the culture of it and people working as a community on pronunciation guides, and then even just the idea that this set came after Lord of the Rings, after Commander Masters, after Wilds of Eldraine, after Doctor Who, and it was just banger after banger after banger, and then this still lived up to its expectations, had people excited, and sold well. And several of the singles are still moving, right? That's gotta say something for the cards in the set. Like, it was almost set up to not be able to succeed with that many bangers before it, but it still did. So yeah, hats off to everybody who worked on Lost Caverns of Ixalan. But y'all let me know. Did you like a different card this year? Did you think a different set was your favorite set of the year? And I'd be curious to come back and look at this a year from now and see how this holds up. Also, just let me know if you like at all the idea of doing this type of video to just do a made up award show, because the Deuter Award sounds silly, but I had fun with it. But if you are getting into Arena for the first time or know somebody that is, check out this video I have that'll give you some shortcuts and some things that can make it easier for you to pick up.